I froze as I watched my wife kissing her lover, then I replied, "The divorce is already signed," and even then she hesitated, as if only then did she understand the weight of what had happened. I turned away, my heart in pieces, but certain that I deserved better. What she didn't know is that, at that very moment, I wasn't just ending a marriage, I was saying goodbye to a version of myself that believed love was enough, that fidelity alone sustained a relationship, that respect was guaranteed and mutual when you shared your life with someone. And even after all that, even after the scene that still replays like a cursed film in my memory, even after hearing the sound of the kiss she never gave me again, I still wondered where I went wrong. Because, yes, that's what betrayal does. It breaks, it tears, it mutilates everything we thought we knew about the other person, and worse, about ourselves. You start to question every silence, every look, every moment you thought everything was fine, when, in fact, maybe you were already being betrayed. I remembered the times I'd come home early and she'd been in the shower longer than usual. The times her phone would vibrate and she'd say she was just her friend from work. The silent dinners where I thought it was just the fatigue of the routine, not the weight of guilt. I remembered the last trip we took together, her staring into space while I tried to make plans for the following year. I remembered everything. Because betrayal doesn't come just with the act. It comes with the brutal regression of memory. It comes like a tsunami that floods even the good memories. And you no longer know what was true, what was an act, what was love, and what was just a facade. She tried to move on with the other man. She tried to build a new version of the life we had with him. But what she didn't understand, and perhaps never will, is that love can't be recycled. It can't be pushed from one place to another. Love is construction, it's surrender, it's a daily choice. She traded a story for a fantasy, a home for a momentary desire, a partner for a lover. And the bill came. It always does. Sooner or later, the mirror comes due. And she, who once smiled confidently, now carries in her eyes a guilt that can't be erased with makeup, that can't be dissolved with justifications. That glow of hers, that charm that captivated me for so long, now carries a weariness, a soullessness. As if, in losing me, she'd lost a piece of herself. But me? I didn't stay on the floor. I fell, yes. I sank. I cried alone in the bathroom. I spent sleepless nights wondering what he had that I didn't, what she sought that I didn't give. I spent days staring at the ceiling, reliving our story as if it were possible to rewrite the ending. But it wasn't. And one day, without warning, the pain began to turn into learning. I began to look at myself differently. I began to realize it wasn't me who was missing. It was her who had been absent for so long. And that was when, for the first time in a long time, someone looked at me truthfully. Without ulterior motives, without averting their gaze, without guilt or excuses. A serene smile, a gentle presence, a silent loyalty that needed no promises to be felt. She didn't need to say she was with me. I knew. I felt. I lived. And that was love, the kind of love that doesn't hurt, that doesn't injure, that doesn't betray. When my ex came to me, her eyes red and her voice trembling, I already knew what she was going to say. Because regret has a scent. It has gestures. It has silence. And she arrived carrying them all. She didn't come to fight, nor to apologize verbally. She came tearing herself apart, trying to pick up the pieces of something she herself destroyed. I heard everything. I didn't interrupt. I didn't react. Because there, in that moment, I was no longer the betrayed man. I was the man who had rebuilt himself. And when she finished, when her eyes begged me for a chance, I simply said, "I forgive you, but I'm not going back." That's when the door closed. Not with anger. But with care. Because forgiveness wasn't for her. It was for me. But what she didn't expect was to see me holding hands with another woman. And it wasn't jealousy that hurt her. It was the contrast. It was realizing how peaceful I was, how much that woman beside me looked at me like she'd never looked before. And in that instant, as if she'd been slapped in the face by an invisible force, the penny dropped. Because it wasn't about what she'd lost anymore. It was about what I'd gained. And her. She kept the memories. The flashes of our story. The letters she never read. Because yes, I wrote letters. Notes. Loose words on scraps of paper. Things she never read carefully. Things she kept in boxes forgotten in a closet somewhere. But one day, after all that, she opened that box. She read every word as if it were her last chance to hear my voice. And there, between lines written with sincere love, she discovered the man she never truly knew. The man she had, but never saw. The man she lost not because he stopped loving, but because she chose not to love him enough. And now, each of those words that were once ignored are like thorns in her skin. Because the greatest pain of betrayal isn't always being betrayed. Sometimes, it's realizing that you were the one who betrayed someone who truly loved you. And that this person, instead of taking revenge, simply moved on. Happy. Empowered. Loved. And the worst loneliness there is knowing that the love of your life doesn't hate you. They just don't belong to you anymore. But there was something she didn't know yet. A detail that would change everything. Something that explained why their love had died so quietly, why even before the betrayal, there was something about her that had already driven him away, a gesture, an attitude, a mistake made years before. Something she herself couldn't remember, but which he never forgot. And when that comes to light, nothing will ever be the same again. Welcome to the channel. Here, no form of betrayal is romanticized or justified. All stories are fictional, but the feelings they evoke are real, because the pain of being betrayed is devastating, and the moral behind each narrative is clear: cheating destroys, corrodes and leaves marks that not even time can erase. Get ready now to dive into a story shocking, intense and unforgettable. Take a deep breath, because what comes next will shake you up. His name was Daniel, and for many years, he believed that love was a construction built with patience, silence, and surrender. He had a calm way of being, a deep gaze that seemed to see beyond what was said, and a strange habit of caring for everything around him, as if, by keeping the world organized, he could protect the heart he carried within. He worked as an architect, and perhaps that's why he saw beauty even in ruins. He believed that everything could be rebuilt with the will, time, and respect. He was discreet, sensitive, and attentive to the small details. He was the kind of person who remembered the date of their first kiss, the taste of the pizza on their second night together, the song that played when she smiled for the first time with her eyes closed. He loved intensely, but without fanfare. And it was exactly this kind of love he offered her from the beginning. Her name was Helena, a woman with an easy smile and a presence that effortlessly lit up a room. She worked in marketing and knew better than anyone how to choose the right words for any situation. She had ambition in her eyes, but also a tenderness that, for a long time, completely enchanted Daniel. She was impulsive, cheerful, and full of energy. When they met at a silly event with mutual friends, he was struck by the way she spoke with her hands, how her eyes sparkled when she told stories, how she could laugh at herself. And she, in turn, felt welcomed by his steady calm, as if she had found an anchor amid the daily chaos of her life. It wasn't overwhelming passion, it was a meeting of wills that transformed into routines, and then into plans, into intimacy, into shared dreams. Those were good years, full of shared achievements. They rented a small, cozy apartment where every corner seemed to speak of the story they were writing together. Helena tended the plants on the balcony with the same dedication Daniel put into the books on the shelf. They cooked simple dinners, watched series on the couch with bundled blankets, and on Sundays, walked around the neighborhood with the dog, laughing about random things as if the whole world were just that moment between them. They had codes, inside jokes, songs that made them look at each other and know exactly what the other was thinking. They had security, complicity, and for a time, all of this seemed enough. But love, when not watered with real presence, begins to dry up without warning. And although Daniel remained there, present in body and intention, something in Helena began to change over the years. It was subtle at first, a delay here, a tiredness there, a flimsy excuse he'd rather swallow than question. Routine, for her, began to weigh heavily. She felt there was something more beyond the quiet life they'd built. Helena began to distance herself emotionally, even though she still said, "I love you," before bed. She was there, but she no longer inhabited the same space as him. Her eyes began to seek other landscapes. And he, perhaps out of fear or naivete, was slow to notice. Even so, Daniel continued to love. Perhaps more strongly, precisely because he felt he was losing her in silence. He invested time, created surprises, suggested trips, tried to reinvent weekends. Helena smiled, thanked, kissed, but her eyes no longer smiled with her entire body. There was a growing discomfort, an absence of real presence, a hurried touch, an automatic speech. She avoided long conversations, dodged sincere questions, hid behind work, her cell phone, the commitments that arose with increasing frequency. Daniel noticed the signs, but fought against reality. Because loving, sometimes, is also insisting where there is no longer room for anything else. Among their friends, they still seemed like the perfect couple. They laughed at social gatherings, took photos together, and maintained a semblance of harmony as if fulfilling a tacit contract with the world. But their intimacy was already fragile. Helena avoided prolonged touching, responded impatiently, and sought distractions. And Daniel, deep down, knew it. But it took him a while to accept it. He began to question himself more often, to look in the mirror with doubt, to try to find within himself the reason for her distance. He demanded of himself, molded himself, reduced himself, hoping that she would see him as she had before. But something in her had changed, silently and irreversibly. Still, there were good times. There were memories, there were fragments of affection, there were days when everything seemed to fall back into place. That was what kept him there, hope. Memory. The love that, even wounded, still beat strong in his chest. But her gestures were cold. And he, little by little, began to store the pain in silence. He began writing again, as he had before meeting her, small notes, fragments of feelings he never shared. He filled drawers with words that found no space in their daily routine. Helena, on the other hand, seemed increasingly absent. She arrived late, was always tired, avoided dinners, movies, Sundays. And he, trying not to suffocate, offered her space. It was an unbalanced love. Daniel gave his whole heart while receiving crumbs. But even so, he believed it was all a phase. That time would heal. That the feelings would align again. Because when you truly love, it's hard to see that the other person is no longer there. It's hard to accept that dedication isn't reciprocated, that love has become a burden, that affection has become an obligation. Daniel stood firm because he believed couples weather storms together. Because I had hope. Because he was loyal. Because he couldn't imagine his life without her. Not yet. And Helena. Helena was a whirlwind of emotions she couldn't name. She felt trapped, suffocated, misunderstood. And even though Daniel tried everything, even though he seemed willing to rebuild, she had already distanced herself too much to see the value she had in being by his side. Not out of malice. But emptiness. Out of ego. Because she wanted to experience something different without knowing exactly what she was looking for. And the gap between them only grew. Communication became fragile, touches became occasional. Good mornings came without eye contact. Kisses felt like commitments. And the bed became neutral territory. Even so, the days went on. The world didn't stop. They continued going out for family lunches, birthdays, and get-togethers. They continued to be the couple in the photos, the pair everyone silently envied. And that was what hurt Daniel, knowing that she still introduced him as, "my husband," to others, while at home, she barely saw him. He, however, didn't give up. He planned a surprise trip to try to rekindle the flame. He chose a place where they'd spent one of their first vacations together, thought about the details, the schedules, the small gestures that might remind her of the beginning. He wanted to recapture her gaze. But she refused, citing unavoidable work commitments. The refusal was a rupture. And from that moment on, something in him began to break. Not in fury, but in silent sadness. The trip didn't happen. The suitcase he'd left half-packed in the room was wordlessly emptied. And he began to observe more. Helena no longer hid her indifference so much. She no longer worried about disguising her boredom. And he no longer insisted so much. He began to save her smiles, to hide her notes. To live with his eyes open. He began to notice how she dressed up more to go out alone. How her cell phone was never left on the table. How her messages were accompanied by smiles that weren't meant for him. But still, betrayal wasn't a certainty. It was a suspicion stifled by hope. And Daniel, out of loyalty to the feeling they'd once built, still resisted believing it. Because accepting it would bring everything down. And he wasn't ready. Not yet. That's why he stood firm, even though the ground was cracked. That's why he continued loving silently, trying to keep alive what had already died in her heart. And it's at this point in the story that everything begins to change. Because a choice made in silence, a seemingly small decision, will be the trigger for a revelation that will completely transform both of their lives. And when the truth comes out, there will be no more room for doubts, for excuses, for second chances. Because love, when betrayed, doesn't die screaming. It dies quietly, deep in the heart, and sometimes, it never returns. Helena was growing more and more distant. The small gestures that once filled the silence between them had disappeared without warning. She no longer woke to the kisses on the back of her neck that Daniel insisted on leaving every morning, nor did she remember her coffee the way he made it, exactly the way she liked it, with a little milk, no sugar. Her eyes were always elsewhere, and her mind was far from home. She spent more time outside than inside, claiming meetings, new projects, short trips, emergency commitments. And Daniel, no longer naive, observed everything silently. No longer as someone who didn't know, but as someone who was beginning to accept that there was something between them he could no longer reach. And it hurt with a dull intensity, like a deep ache that never subsided. He was trying to convince himself it was just a phase. That maybe she was confused, overwhelmed, emotionally drained. But something inside him was already beginning to whisper that it wasn't. That Helena's gaze no longer pierced him. That her hugs were timed. That her kisses felt like excuses. The nights were long, and Daniel didn't sleep well. He spent hours turning on his side, trying to fit his body into the emptiness she left in the bed. He began reading more, writing frequently, trying to find in words the solace he no longer received at home. The dog, his silent companion, seemed to feel the same abandonment. He would lie down by the bedroom door and stay there, motionless, as if he, too, waited for Helena to return different, more present, more herself. Friends noticed. In occasional encounters, Daniel seemed quieter, more introspective. He no longer smiled easily, and when asked about her, he responded with short, gentle sentences, trying to maintain the dignity of what remained. He didn't like to expose their relationship, even though inside he felt like screaming. There was a terrible fear within him of being the last to know, of loving alone, of keeping alive a story that, for her, had already died. But he was a loyal man, and loyalty, for him, was an unbreakable pact. He continued to take care of the house, the details, the important dates. He prepared a simple dinner for their wedding anniversary, played soft music, lit candles in the living room. Helena arrived late. She didn't apologize. She simply said she was exhausted. She sat down, forced a smile, and asked if he could save everything for the weekend. He said yes, but in that moment, something inside him was permanently extinguished. Little by little, Daniel's body began to reject her presence. Not because he had stopped loving, but because the body knows when it is no longer loved. He avoided her touch, not out of pride, but out of self-protection. He no longer asked questions, no longer made plans. He simply watched. The silence between them was now piercing. And yet, she said nothing. She simply continued her busy routine, with her untimely texts, with the smiles that appeared in the reflection of her phone, never looking at him. One random Sunday, she left in the morning, saying she had a last-minute meeting. She took her phone and her laptop, and didn't return until 8 o'clock. Daniel prepared lunch, ate alone, washed the dishes, and spent the afternoon in silence. The dog slept at the foot of the sofa, as if he, too, knew that home was no longer whole. Days later, something caught Daniel's attention. A different scent on Helena's clothes. It wasn't hers, nor his. It was woody, intense, invasive. He didn't comment. He just noticed. Later, he found a pair of earrings in the car's glove compartment, a modern design that didn't suit her style. He asked casually. Helena said they were antiques, that she'd found them among her office belongings. The explanation seemed simple, but her expression was different. There was hesitation, as if the truth were stuck between her teeth. He didn't press the point. He gave a slight nod and went to sleep without another word. The following Monday, Daniel left work early. He got in his car and drove aimlessly for a while, until he decided to stop by the florist where he usually bought Helena's favorite white roses. He bought a small bouquet. He considered surprising her at the office, perhaps with a coffee. He thought, for a moment, that it was still possible to recover what they were missing. Upon arriving, he was informed that she was not in. She had gone to an off-site meeting, alone. The client's name wasn't on the day's agenda. Daniel politely thanked her and left without another word. The bouquet sat forgotten on the car seat as he drove, his fingers gripping the steering wheel tightly. That night, when Helena came home, Daniel was sitting at the table. Dinner was served. There was wine in the glass, and a soft light illuminated the room. She seemed surprised. She said she was exhausted. He simply asked her to sit. She did. They ate in silence. And then he asked, looking straight into her eyes, "Are you with someone?" Her gaze shifted for a second. She smiled strangely. She asked why he thought that. He didn't answer. He simply returned his gaze to his plate and said he just wanted to know. Helena remained silent. She said she didn't know what to say. That maybe they were just in different moments. That she was confused. Daniel nodded again. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He simply accepted. He got up from the table, washed the dishes, and put away the silverware. When she entered the room, he was already lying on his back. She didn't try to talk. She turned out the light and slept on her other side. In the following days, Daniel began to quietly distance himself. He stopped trying. He stopped caring about her arrival time, her flimsy excuses, her new commitments. He started going out more often. He started walking for long hours around the neighborhood. He frequented a quiet coffee shop, where he wrote in the notebook he'd carried since adolescence. He started talking to different people, listening to stories, observing other people's lives. He wasn't looking for anything, just trying to breathe outside the suffocating atmosphere his home had become. Until one Friday afternoon, when he returned home early, Daniel felt his stomach churn. Helena's car was in the garage, even though she'd said she had a meeting until late. The front door was ajar. The sound of muffled laughter echoed from the living room. He entered slowly, his steps firm, his heart racing. And there, in the center of the room where they had shared moments so often, she was. Sitting on another man's lap, laughing with a lightness he hadn't seen in a long time. They didn't immediately notice her presence. But when they did, time seemed to freeze. Helena looked at him with wide eyes. The other man stood, trying to understand what was happening. But Daniel said nothing. He just watched them for a long second. He took an envelope from his pocket and placed it on the table. It was the divorce, already signed. He said firmly, without shouting, that he had known for a long time. He was just waiting for her to have the courage to admit it. And then he looked into her eyes and said, "The divorce is already signed." She hesitated. For the first time, she truly hesitated. As if only then, in that moment, she had understood what she had lost. Then he turned and left. His steps calm, his pain contained, his dignity intact. His heart in pieces, yes. But his soul at peace. His silence was more deafening than any scream. And she stood there, staring blankly into space, feeling for the first time the true weight of her choices. But there was something she didn't know yet. Something he'd been keeping hidden since before everything fell apart. A detail buried in the past, hidden among old papers and forgotten memories. A secret that, when revealed, would make everything take on new meaning. And nothing would ever be the same again. Time had passed with the cruel slowness of someone who insists on prolonging the pain. Daniel, now more centered, no longer wore the devastated expression of the days following the divorce. His eyes, previously drowned in questions that would never be answered, now gazed at the present with a disconcerting serenity. Not because he had stopped feeling, but because he had learned to preserve himself. His reconstruction was not built on anger or revenge. It was built on silence, dignity, and the recognition that sometimes, letting go is the only act of self-love possible. He didn't look for blame, didn't seek solace in other beds, didn't post indirect messages on social media, didn't respond to the gossip of mutual friends. He simply chose the most difficult path, starting over without losing himself. And it was on this path, between lonely coffees, distracted conversations with strangers, and quiet nights of rare peace, that he found someone who truly looked at him. A woman who took her time, who listened more than she spoke, who smiled calmly, who didn't need masks to be loved. And with her, Daniel learned that love, when sincere, is not burdensome. It liberates. Helena, on the other hand, went into freefall. The lover who made her laugh between empty sheets disappeared as quickly as he'd arrived. When she mentioned the word commitment, he dodged it as if he'd heard a sentence. She persisted for a while, trying to mend what had never been real, but soon realized it had been just a detour, and a detour with no return. Loneliness hit her hard when she returned to her old apartment and found the furniture cold, the wardrobe too spacious, and the paintings turned to the wall. It was there, alone, that she allowed herself to mourn everything she had denied. She wept for the loss, for the guilt, for the silent destruction of something that, despite everything, had been true. She even missed Daniel's silences, the way he would arrange her hair while she slept, the low voice with which he called her on Sunday mornings. But time offers no return buttons, and when she finally found the courage to seek him out, he was already a different man. Stronger, lighter, more whole. And beside him, a new, sweet, serene presence that made his eyes smile. When she saw him like that, she understood that she had lost more than a husband, she had lost the version of herself that he loved. She tried to talk. She said she wasn't looking for a second chance, she just needed to be heard. And he, out of respect for their experience, accepted. They sat across from each other in a discreet cafe in the city. She arrived visibly shaken, her face thinner, her eyes sunken, her hands restless. Daniel, with a calm look in his eyes, held his cup in both hands, watching her with a mixture of compassion and distance. She began speaking softly, almost in a whisper. She said she knew she had done wrong, that she didn't expect forgiveness, but that she needed to tell him something. He remained silent. Not out of indifference, but because he wanted to hear everything. Helena hesitated, took a deep breath, and pulled a small, old, time-marked cardboard box from her bag. She placed it on the table. She said she had found it while organizing old things. She didn't remember putting it away, but when she opened it, she felt the ground disappear. Daniel looked at the box and immediately understood what it was. It was the box of notes he wrote. Small letters left in her dresser drawer, in her coat pockets, in her backpack. Notes of love, of concern, of gratitude. Notes she never read, that she always put aside, that now, years later, she had decided to open. She said she read each one. And that, with each word, she felt as if she were being emptied inside. She said she didn't know he loved her that way. That she never imagined the depth of his feelings. That she ignored the signs, the care, the silent pleas. She said that, at times, she thought he was cold, detached, distant, when, in truth, he just didn't scream love, he showed it. She cried as she spoke, and Daniel just listened. Not with anger, not with pity. But with the clarity of someone who had cried inside long before. That's when she said, almost voicelessly, that there was something specific that had destroyed her. One note, in particular. One she found folded inside a photography book, his handwriting slightly shaky. It was short but direct. In it, Daniel said, "If you ever feel alone, even by my side, please tell me. I'd rather know you're gone than delude myself with your presence. I love you too much to accept being ignored." She then looked into his eyes, visibly broken, and said, "I read this 2 years after you wrote it. 2 years. And in that moment, I realized you already knew you were losing me. And yet, you continued to love me." Daniel remained silent. He took a sip of his now lukewarm coffee and took a deep breath. Then he said, with disarming calm, that the note had been written the night she had left for a conference and returned the next day without a word. He had stayed awake until 4 in the morning, sitting on the porch, waiting for a call, a message, anything. But none came. That night, he understood that his love was greater than her presence. And it was then that he began to write everything he could no longer say. Helena then revealed what had been eating away at him for weeks. She said that, upon rereading the notes, she remembered something specific she'd buried deep in her memory. One day, long before the betrayal, she'd found Daniel's notebook, the one with his personal notes, and, out of curiosity or carelessness, flipped through a few pages. She read passages about doubts, pain, and insecurities he never verbalized. She read confessions he'd only confided to paper. But instead of reaching out to him, asking questions, accepting them, she closed the notebook, put it back where it belonged, and never mentioned it again. She said that, in that moment, she chose distance. And that was her biggest mistake. Because there, in his silence, was the cry for help she didn't want to hear. Daniel stared at her with steady eyes. There was no hatred there, just an absolute absence of return. He thanked her for the truth, thanked her for her courage. He said that for a long time, he had waited for this kind of conversation. But now, all of this belonged to a version of him that no longer existed. He said he forgave her. Not to alleviate her guilt, but to free himself from the pain that no longer made sense to carry. Helena cried like someone who loses someone for the second time. Not because of abandonment, but because she realized that, even though she was alive, she had become a stranger to the only man who had ever truly loved her. When she got up to leave, Daniel stood there for a moment, staring at his empty cup. Outside, the city went on with its rhythm, indifferent to their pain. But inside that cafe, the past had been buried with a phrase that would never be undone: "I forgive you, but I'm not coming back." And outside, waiting with a slight smile, was the woman who walked beside him today. The one who never had to decipher her silences because she chose to listen to them from the beginning. And when Helena saw her, she understood everything. The kind of love she had lost. The kind of man she would never have again. The kind of pain that never heals, because it comes with the knowledge that it was caused by choice. But something else remained. A hidden piece, a subtle detail she hadn't yet grasped. Something that would explain not only Daniel's pain, but also why he'd never looked back. A secret buried at the root of that silent rupture. And when it came to light, she would realize the true end had begun much earlier than she'd imagined. A week after their meeting at the cafe, Helena appeared again. She didn't come with messages, nor a desperate phone call, nor flowers or rehearsed speeches. She arrived silently, like someone who no longer has certainties, only the remains of dignity. He found her in a downtown art gallery, during a small exhibition of local artists. Daniel was beside his new partner, laughing with a group of people, quiet, in his own world. Helena didn't interrupt. She stood, watching from a distance, like an intruder peering into the life of someone who was once hers and is no longer. Her eyes lingered on Daniel's hand, held tenderly by that serene-faced woman. The gesture was simple but devastating. There was no eye contact. She turned and walked away. But that night he couldn't sleep. Not out of jealousy, not out of pride. But out of the overwhelming clarity that she hadn't just lost the man who loved her, she had lost the right to be part of his story. A few days later, he received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a handwritten letter and an old, yellowed page, taken from a gray-covered notebook. He recognized her handwriting instantly. It was a page from his old personal diary, delicately torn out. The letter, written by Helena, didn't ask for a second chance or an explanation. It simply said, "I return this to you because it belongs to me only in pain. I was wrong. I was so wrong. I just wanted you to know." Daniel kept that paper for long minutes, without reading it. He didn't need to. He knew exactly what it was. That page contained a part of himself he had left behind long ago. A broken, weak, exposed part. And one that had remained in the hands of someone who didn't know how to care for it. It was then that he allowed himself to remember that night. The true night when everything began to fall apart, long before the betrayal. A seemingly ordinary night, without arguments, without tears. A night without witnesses or screams. Just two people lying in the same bed, looking in opposite directions. Daniel had written in his diary that day, after seeing Helena talking on the phone in the kitchen, in a low voice, laughing in a way no place offered her at that moment. He didn't suspect a lover. He suspected something else, disinterest. The indifference that was beginning to seep through the cracks in routine. And he wrote. He translated it with words that still hurt to read. "Today I understood that I don't need you to lie to me. It's enough that you don't see me. I'm becoming invisible to her. And that hurts more than any infidelity." That sentence stayed with him for years, like a wound that heals but leaves a mark. The secret wasn't an affair. It wasn't a hidden scene or an uncovered lie. The secret was this, that Helena lost him long before she slept with another man. He lost her when she stopped seeing him, when she stopped listening to his silences, when she ignored his pain. The deception was only the consequence. The true betrayal had begun with neglect. With that night she didn't turn to hug him. With that time he didn't read the note he left in her wallet. With every, "I'm tired," she said as an excuse not to feel. That was the betrayal that hurt the most. Daniel walked through the park that afternoon with the folded sheet of paper in his pocket. There was something liberating in knowing that everything, even pain, finally had a shape, a name. It was no longer a sea of unanswered questions. It was clear, definitive. He had been loved poorly, not for lack of passion, but for lack of care. And he understood that sometimes love dies without scandal, without dramatic ruptures, without third parties. It dies when the little things are ignored. When the other person ceases to be important in everyday life. That was what pushed him out of that relationship long before he signed a paper. That same night, Helena appeared again, but this time in front of the house they'd shared for years. He didn't knock. He sat on the sidewalk with a blanket draped over his legs and a box of notes on his lap. Daniel watched her from the window, unmoving. He watched as she opened them one by one, as she reread the words with a visible tremor, as if each sentence struck her hard. Daniel's new partner asked if he should intervene. He shook his head. There was no anger. There was no need to interrupt what had to happen. That night, Helena faced the ghost she had created, the version of herself she'd stopped loving without realizing it. The one she'd abandoned in her routine, in the comfort of knowing he was always there. But he was no longer there. The next day, he saw her again, but it wasn't a coincidence. She approached with hesitant steps and asked if she could speak to him alone. He agreed, and they walked along a quiet path, between trees and wooden benches. She didn't cry this time. Her voice was steady, her eyes clear. He said he finally understood. That he always thought he'd lost her because of infidelity. But no. He'd lost her before, when he stopped caring about love, when he took it for granted. I thought you were there, always. I thought your way of loving was silent, unshakable. And it was fragile, but it was also fragile. And I broke it without realizing it. Daniel listened to her. Each word fell like raindrops on a land that could no longer flourish. He didn't interrupt her. When she finished, she simply said, "I've never been perfect, you know. But I always have been. I always tried. I just needed you to look at me." Helena nodded. I knew there was nothing more to say. I wasn't expecting a promise, a caress, or an opportunity. I just wanted him to know that, finally, he understood. The greatest punishment wasn't losing him. It was realizing, too late, that she had lost him alone. That she had been pushing him little by little toward the exit without even realizing that he, silently, was leaving. That afternoon, as she walked away along the same path, Daniel looked at the horizon. Not with sadness. With respect. He had closed a chapter. Not with slamming doors or censure. With understanding. Because sometimes the most painful closure is the one that comes without hatred. Only with the certainty that there is nothing more to be done. He returned home, where he was waiting for a table, a simple dinner, an honest look. And when he sat before that woman with a serene soul, he knew he had found something he hadn't sought, but deserved, a love that didn't need to be proven. A love that saw him. That listened to him. And Helena returned. Helena returned to the empty apartment, the box in her hands, no photos on the walls, no notes in her pockets. She sat on the floor, amidst the shadows, and knew, with brutal certainty, that it wasn't the betrayal that had left her alone. This is everything he'd done before this. Everything he hadn't said. Everything he hadn't heard. Everything he'd ignored when he was still willing to stay. That was the wound I would never close. Daniel returned home in complete silence that afternoon. The air had a distinct weight, as if each step toward the door was also an inner farewell to everything he had been, to everything he had had to hold silently for years. It wasn't sadness that enveloped him, but a precise blend of compassion, certainty, and a strange kind of relief. Finally, the story with Helena had reached a point of closure, not because she had decided so, but because, since his reconstruction, he no longer needed answers, explanations, or new promises. What had once been an urgency to understand had transformed into clarity. He no longer sought emotional justice, no longer expected perfect apologies or heroic gestures of redemption. What remained was a serene space, a kind of hard-won peace that arises when one ceases to inhabit a place that no longer recognizes one. His current partner was waiting for him with dinner ready, but there were no questions. She looked at him as soon as she walked through the door and knew something important had happened. Daniel took her hand, and without many words, they sat down to eat together. There was a mutual trust in their gestures, a tacit respect that needed no explanation. She didn't ask for the details of her encounter with Helena. Not for lack of interest, but because she trusted the truth they shared, one that required no accountability or proof of love. Daniel was internally grateful for this stillness, this way she had of being there without intruding, of accompanying without pressuring. That night, when they lay down, he turned to her and said, in a low voice, that he felt free. She didn't respond with words, just caressed his face with her fingertips and kissed his chest, exactly where his heart beat strongest. It was all he needed. Meanwhile, Helena had returned to the apartment with its white walls and furniture that now seemed strange to him. He paused in the hallway before entering, key in hand, motionless for several minutes. It wasn't just a door he was about to open. It was the entrance to a life that no longer had meaning. As he turned the lock, the hollow sound reminded him of the echo of a house that had ceased to be a home. He walked through the dimly lit space, touching the edges of the furniture with his fingertips as if they were relics of a past struggling to sustain itself. He left the box of notes on the dining room table and sat in front of it, without opening it. I no longer needed to reread the words. It was no longer a matter of understanding, but of accepting that he had crossed a line of no return. In the days that followed, Helena didn't go out much. He dedicated himself to trying to fill the gaps with activities he'd previously ignored. She started cooking for herself, reading books Daniel had left forgotten on the shelf, listening to the records they'd once shared. He wasn't doing this out of nostalgia, but because he needed to understand that part of his story was real. He wondered, at every step, at what point he'd begun to disconnect. Not from his marriage, but from himself. He recognized that the infidelity was merely the most visible symptom of a long, deep neglect that began much earlier, when he decided to look outward at what he hadn't dared to face within. He realized, with painful slowness, that it wasn't Daniel's abandonment that affected her most, but rather that she had unconsciously abandoned herself first. One afternoon, while tidying up the closet drawers, she found a notebook where Daniel had scribbled a list of things he wanted to do with her: trips, shows, dinners, shared projects. Some were crossed out, others were just beginning with an unfinished word. He read aloud a line: learn to dance together. They never did. There was always an excuse. Work, fatigue, disinterest. Helena brought her hand to her face and took a deep breath. I understood now that the greatest losses don't always come with screams or slammed doors. Sometimes they present themselves in the form of opportunities we miss, gestures we take for granted, people we take for granted. I didn't need Daniel's forgiveness. He had already given it. What he couldn't give was a place in her current life. And that, as much as it hurt, was irreparable. Daniel, for his part, had resumed old projects, things he had put off when his relationship with Helena took up all his emotional space. He began writing again, not as before, as a form of outburst, but with intention, with structure, as if each word helped him rebuild himself from the essential. His new partner motivated him to believe in the present without dragging the past, without fear. He didn't compete with Helena's memories, because he understood that a healthy love doesn't need to overshadow the past, it just needs to be authentic. There was a form of intimacy between them that was woven into everyday life, making coffee in silence, reading together without needing to speak, looking at each other as they crossed the street, certain they were in the right place. And this, for Daniel, was a form of redemption. The moral dilemma that crept into him, however, was deeper than he imagined. Not about returning to Helena, because that was no longer an option, but about how to live knowing that he loved her in her darkest hour, that he held a love that crumbled in his hands, that he was loyal even when he had no reason to be. Had I been foolish to persist for so long? Naive to not see the signs? Brave or courageous for not giving up immediately? Deep down, he knew there were no simple answers. Human relationships are not logical equations. The only thing he could do was honor the version of himself that held him together when everything fell apart. There was no regret in him. Only a kind of silent reverence for the man he was when everything hurt, and for the man he is now, more lucid, stronger, more himself. Helena, realizing her life wasn't moving forward, tried to reconnect with some friends, but discovered that even there, things had changed. Some distanced themselves after the breakup, others took sides without fully understanding the story. Conversations were superficial and, in many cases, fraught with discomfort. It wasn't a social punishment. It was the side effect of a decision. In their inner circle, it became clear that she had betrayed more than just a relationship, she had betrayed a self-image that everyone valued. What weighed most heavily on her wasn't the finger pointing, but that, when she looked in the mirror, she no longer proudly recognized the woman she was. One Sunday morning, Daniel took his partner to an old bookstore he often visited alone. He showed her poems, authors, and underlined phrases from books that had marked his life. She listened to him with genuine attention, asking questions and laughing tenderly. At one point, as they leafed through a book of poems, she read a line aloud: "Love is not waiting for someone to save us, it's learning to save ourselves so we can love in peace." Daniel stood still, watching her, and knew he was ready to close the circle completely. Not because she was the antithesis of Helena, but because she represented something she'd never had in her previous relationship: emotional reciprocity. What lay ahead wasn't an abrupt ending or a perfect resolution. It was the beginning of a deeper understanding, a mature acceptance that some people come to teach us how unlovable we are, and that sometimes losing someone who didn't know how to care for them is the greatest way to gain. And yet, without anyone knowing, a final encounter was approaching. Not by choice, but by destiny. An inevitable intersection, a final scene that would bring face to face all they were, all they pretended to be, and all they were, finally, no longer. On that cloudy Friday morning, the city seemed to move more slowly. Daniel had decided to take the day off, something he rarely did, not out of exhaustion, but out of intuition. He woke before his alarm clock rang, and for long minutes he observed the woman sleeping beside him, her face serene and her fingers intertwined with his, as if, even unconsciously, his body insisted, "I'm here." He got up carefully, made coffee in silence, opened the windows, and let the cool breeze fill the room. There was an unusual calm that morning, a kind of preview of something approaching. The sensation wasn't exactly uncomfortable, but it carried a subtle weight, like the muffled sound of distant thunder. He glanced at the bookshelf, at some papers on the table, at an old picture frame where, by conscious choice, he had placed a photo of himself gazing out to sea, alone. He no longer needed to fill the spaces with images from the past. Time had done its work of removing from the altar those who never knew how to stand. On the other side of the city, Helena walked aimlessly. She wore an old jacket and carried a backpack with few things: a book, a bottle of water, a notebook, a yellowed photo of the two of them smiling on a forgotten trip. She didn't know why she still carried it, but she also couldn't let it go. She had spent the last few days trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy: online courses, a few job offers, the occasional reunion with people from the past, but everything felt out of place. Each attempt at routine felt like an ill-fitting disguise. She knew she couldn't ask Daniel for anything more, but inside her, there was an urgent need to close something that was left unfinished. It wasn't about reconquest, nor a desire to reclaim what was lost. It was simply the search for a dignified ending, a final gesture from someone who had transformed too late, but still needed to be true. Around 10 in the morning, she summoned the courage and sent a message: "If you can, I'd like to meet you. Just for a few minutes. I promise." Daniel read the text while sipping his second coffee, sitting on the porch. He took a deep breath, not out of discomfort, but out of recognition. He knew the meeting was inevitable. And, on some level, necessary. He responded with a simple, "Okay, 3 p.m. at the lake park." Nothing more. No need. When she arrived, she found Daniel sitting on a bench under a tree, legs crossed and eyes closed. He looked calm, mature, someone who had weathered a storm and now enjoyed the peace that was earned, not begged for. Helena approached slowly, sat beside him without saying anything for a few seconds, simply staring at the lake ahead. The sound of birds filled the silence that had once been oppressive between them, but now seemed merely respectful. When he opened his eyes, he looked at her without surprise, without harshness. Simply waiting. She began speaking calmly, as if she had thought deeply about each word. She said she wasn't looking for him to apologize, because she had already apologized. Nor to try to recover what had been destroyed, because that had already been understood as impossible. "I just wanted you to know who I am today," she said, her voice firm but choked. She told him about the months following the divorce, about how she began to encounter versions of herself she had never really considered. She spoke of the conversations with the mirror, the sleepless nights, the growing discomfort with the void she had previously filled with distractions. I discovered that it wasn't you who made me feel alone, it was me who had been absent from myself for years. Daniel listened to everything without interrupting. Not out of coldness, but because he knew he had to let her speak to the end, without rushing, without deviating. And she continued, now more fluidly, saying that, little by little, she began to remember how hard he'd tried. The notes, the light touches, the conversations she'd ended in a hurry. She said she'd found a note in which he spoke of fear, not of betrayal, but of no longer being seen by her, and that it was like a mirror shattering before her eyes. I destroyed the place where someone felt safe, she murmured, her eyes fixed on her hands, her fingers clenched as if trying to keep her heart from escaping through her skin. Daniel then spoke for the first time. He said that listening to all of that wasn't pleasant, but necessary. That there was a time when he would have given anything to hear those words. But now, the silence between them took on new meaning. Today, I understand that my mistake was staying too long after realizing you were gone. But I also understand that, at that moment, it was the most I could do. I went as far as I could. And you didn't find me there. She nodded, visibly touched by his clarity. There was no resentment, no bitterness. Only maturity. And that, more than any rebuke, tore her apart. I didn't expect you to forgive me, but when you said you did, without wanting to go back, it was the hardest moment of my life, she confessed, her voice now wavering. Daniel looked at the lake, took a slow breath, and replied that forgiveness wasn't to alleviate her guilt, but to free his future. I didn't want to carry anything with your name on it anymore. After a brief silence, she took the old photo from her backpack, gently handed it to him, and said that, despite everything, that image still represented a beautiful time. We were happy. At least for a while. And that, too, needs to be recognized. Daniel took the photo, looked at it for a moment, and replied softly, yes, we were. But happiness also needs to be nurtured. And it didn't survive. That conversation had no grand finale, no hugs, no scandalous tears. Helena stood, adjusted her backpack, and thanked him for listening. Daniel nodded, stood too, and they walked side by side to the park exit in silence. When they said goodbye, she extended her hand. After a brief second, he took it firmly, and that was it. A gesture of respect, of closure, of gratitude for what they had been, without promises, without a trace of what if. Just two former lovers now walking in different directions, aware that, however painful, true love only survives where there is reciprocity. In the days that followed, Daniel devoted himself to writing. He began a book, not about betrayal, nor about sad endings, but about new beginnings. Stories of people who decided to rebuild their lives after being shattered by the neglect of others, and sometimes, their own. The woman who now shared his days read the first chapters, moved. She said that, between the lines, she recognized his pain, but more than that, she recognized his courage. You turned a wound into something beautiful, she said. And he, smiling lightly for the first time as he spoke of the past, replied, because what matters is not what they did to me, but what I chose to do afterward. Helena, in turn, returned to her routine with less internal noise. There were no more doubts, no more hopes. Just an almost melancholic acceptance that some things don't get a second chance. But this awareness also brought freedom. She became more honest with people, with her feelings, with moments. She knew she couldn't undo what she did, but she could still avoid repeating to others what she had done to Daniel. And that, in itself, was a path of silent redemption. But fate still had one last twist in store, an unexpected, almost symbolic event, that would put everything into perspective and show that, even after the end, certain stories continue to touch us, even when they are no longer part of our lives. Months passed since Helena and Daniel's last meeting, and life, as it always does, moved on. Each found a different rhythm to their existence, like two paths that once walked together and now ran parallel, no longer intersecting. Daniel was in a serene stage of silent construction. The book he had begun to write was taking shape with a depth he himself hadn't expected. It wasn't a work about hurt or resentment, but about choices, about everything that's lost when people stop seeing themselves. The text flowed with truth because it came from someone who knew firsthand what it felt like to be in the background, to offer one's best and be forgotten in the corner, to be a presence without being noticed. And it was this pain, transformed into words, that attracted the attention of a small but deeply sensitive publisher. The book would be published, and with it, Daniel would begin to share his story with others who, like him, had learned to survive after the fall. Meanwhile, the woman who now walked beside him, firmly and lightly, became more than a refuge. She was now home. Not by filling a void left by another, but by building something new, unhurried, without comparison. Between them, there was a clean exchange, an emotional maturity that dispensed with games, a kind of love that required no effort to prove what was already evident in their looks, their gestures, their routine. They made plans. Nothing grandiose, but projects that, together, seemed gigantic: traveling to the countryside, adopting another dog, maybe living in a house with a garden. Daniel found himself living a version of life he never believed would exist for him. Not because it was perfect, but because it was sincere. Helena, on the other hand, was facing a completely different process. The silence that had once seemed necessary now felt too heavy. She began to wonder if she would have acted differently if she had matured sooner. But these questions, she knew, were no longer useful. The answer she had been searching for had been right in front of her all along. Time does not forgive those who wait too long to realize the value of true love. The betrayal was just the final shovel of dirt on a relationship she herself had neglected. She now lived in a smaller apartment, a space she had decorated herself with as little as possible. She replaced the old furniture, repainted the walls, removed everything that reminded her of her past, but still, she couldn't escape herself. The new version she was trying to build was more conscious, more present, more human. But also more lonely. She discovered in her pain the importance of paying attention to others, of daily care, of truly listening. Only now, there was no Daniel to share this learning. There was only the echo of absence, the reflection of everything she had failed to do when she had the chance. An unexpected invitation arrived by email, a lecture on human relationships, where Daniel would be the featured guest to speak about his recently released book. She hesitated for days. She didn't know if her presence would be welcome, or even if she was ready to see him in a different light, being applauded, recognized for what she'd never appreciated while they were together. But something stronger drove her. She needed to be there, not for him, but for herself. She needed to face his new life with sincere eyes, without trying to fit in, just to witness the end of the man who had once loved her completely. He sat discreetly in the last seats in the auditorium. The room was full. The audience was attentive. Daniel took the stage with a slight smile, his gaze serene, and began to speak. He didn't name names, didn't present his story as a drama, but spoke of relationships as someone who understands the invisible scars of those who have loved alone. He said there are two types of loss, the kind life imposes and the kind we choose without realizing it. And that, between them, there's an abyss where regret resides. He spoke about presence, about listening, about the small daily omissions that silently kill loves. And when he finished, there was a long, genuine applause, the kind born not just of admiration, but of recognition. Helena, sitting among the anonymous, felt a mixture of pride and sadness. There was no anger. Only a bitter acceptance. She didn't approach him after the lecture, didn't try to speak to him. She preferred to leave in silence, as if understanding that the end of a story doesn't always require a final word. On the way out, she passed the woman who now occupied her former seat. They exchanged a brief glance. There was no hostility, no jealousy. Just a moment of understanding. The woman recognized her, perhaps by the way Helena looked at her. And Helena, with a subtle gesture, gave an almost imperceptible wave, as if to say, "Take good care of him." And then she left, without looking back. Daniel later learned she was there. Someone mentioned seeing her leave before closing. He wasn't surprised. In a way, I knew from the start she was going. But I also knew that moment wasn't about the two of them anymore. It was about him. About the man he was, about what he had to lose to find himself. And he felt, with maturity, that the cycle had closed for good. For the first time in years, nothing weighed on him anymore. Helena moved on with her life with greater awareness. She became a kind of counselor among her friends, always saying, with harsh sincerity, that the biggest mistake of her life was believing that love could wait indefinitely. Silently, she began to help other women avoid making the same mistakes. It was her way of transforming her mistake into something useful. There was no redemption in the traditional sense, but there was clarity. And perhaps that was enough. Daniel and his partner traveled weeks later. They went to a simple place, surrounded by nature, where he finally delivered the final chapters of the book to the publisher. During a walk, she hugged him from behind and told him she loved him in a quiet but intense way. He smiled, held her hand, and replied, "This is the kind of love I've been waiting for all my life." It wasn't a spur-of-the-moment statement. It was a mature, definitive declaration, the certainty that he had found peace after having endured the most painful struggle, that of being forgotten within a story where he was the only one who remembered everything. And so, each followed the path they chose, or were inevitably led to follow. Some with scars, some with new stories, all with profound lessons. Because when true love is betrayed, it never returns. There may be forgiveness, there may be compassion, but the purity of that feeling, that dies there. What remains are memories, lessons learned, and, for the lucky ones, a new beginning. Comment below what you thought of this story, we'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe to the channel now to see more stories like this. This narrative starkly shows us what many ignore: betrayal doesn't just destroy a relationship, it erodes love, trust, respect, and, most importantly, the value a person holds within themselves. Betrayal is an abyss that starts small but engulfs everything around it. It destroys families, numbs feelings, and when the penny drops, all that's left is emptiness. This channel does not support, justify, or romanticize any kind of betrayal. Here, we tell fictional stories that reveal the real consequences of choices that should never have been made. And if there's one thing this story teaches us, it's that love deserves to be nurtured every day, before it's too late.